idea of what are we to make of this idea of clinical psychoanalysis as a soul-making activity? Of course, the idea of soul-making is one of Keats as it relates to the evolution of the self over time in relation to its ongoing relationship to, might we say, godlike internal muse.
Okay, now I'm on.
In the psychoanalytic realm, as described by the psychoanalyst Bion, the evolution of the psyche from its raw, primordial beginnings through dialogue with its internal objects. This is at least the line of thinking of Meg Harris Williams in her book, The Veil of Soul Making. So, about the format, today's speakers, Don Carveth and Stephen Fowler, will talk for the first half, 45 minutes or so. This portion of the talk will be recorded, as you just heard. We ask you to hold off until the second half before entering the dialogue, which we will very much invite you to do then. For the duration, please make sure that your audio is muted. And given the large audience, we will ask when the time comes that you raise your hand in the chat function if you want to make a comment. Simi Shahal, also a member of the Freud Cafe Committee, will also be following the chat function should people prefer to make a written comment, though we unlikely won't get to all the comments. The second half will not be recorded. So let me introduce you to our speakers. Don Carveth is Emeritus Professor of Sociology and Social and Political Thought and a Senior Scholar at York University, Toronto. He's a training and supervising analyst at the Canadian Institute of Psychoanalysis, past director of the Toronto Institute of Psychoanalysis, and past editor-in-chief of the Canadian Journal of Psychoanalysis. His published books on guilt include Guilt, A Contemporary Introduction, 2023, The Still Small Voice, Psychoanalytic Reflections on Guilt and Conscience, 2013. Stephen Fowler has worked as an emergency physician for 30 years and as a psychoanalyst in private practice for 15. Stephen has a long-standing interest in exploring how psychoanalysis and Christianity mutually benefit each other. His book, Probing the Mind to Free the Soul Toward a Psychoanalytic Protest Theology, was published in 2017. So over to Don.
Thanks, Vivian. Thanks, Stephen, for agreeing to do this. Thanks, everyone, for showing up. So, psychoanalysis as soul-making, Vivian already mentioned the idea stemming from John Keats. His sentence is, quotes, "Think of the world, if you will, as the veil of soul-making." Okay, well, let me make a few comments first about the diagram that I chose to be on the flyer. You know, we start with the egg and then emerges a caterpillar, and then the caterpillar goes into the chrysalis, and then the mature butterfly emerges from the chrysalis. So this is a diagram of a natural process of development on the pre-human level, on the level of the biosphere. Of course, human beings are rooted both in the biosphere and in what has been called the noosphere, which is the uniquely human world of symbolic consciousness and freedom, and therefore anxiety and guilt. So the developmental process obviously is a more complicated one for us. It's not an entirely biologically regulated or biologically determined development, but I would argue that it still is a natural development of the soul. Now, there are many different ways we can define the soul, but for me, This development is, I think of this development in entirely secular terms, not supernatural terms, but natural development. For me, the term soul has no intrinsically supernatural meaning. Essentially, it's equivalent for me to what Winnicott called the true self. And in my view, the true self is directly linked to conscience, quite distinct from the superego. So we've always been an evolutionary discipline. All of our models are evolutionary models. Freud, oral, anal, phallic oedipal, latency, genital. And then, of course, Erickson extends this to youth and the middle years and old age. It's an evolutionary model. Klein's model is equally evolutionary. It's an evolution from PS to D. This can get complicated, and we can talk about a constant oscillation between PS and D, but nevertheless, the Kleinian model of development is that we're going to be helping our patients transcend the splitting and the omnipotence and the narcissism. Let's remember that PS is narcissism. Narcissism resides in PS because in PS, life is a jungle. It's kill or be killed, and you're being hunted by predators. And when you're being hunted by predators, you don't have time to think about other people except as objects to be used in your project of survival. So narcissism predominates in PS. And of course, the aim is to help people move into the realm of the depressive reparative position. People become real then. They have feelings. One begins to care. Well, let's go back to Freud. Kleinians are completely in sync with Freud here, which is why I call myself a Kleinian Freudian. I remain a Freudian. In 1914, Freud said it very clearly. Unless we can begin to love, we must fall ill, and we must fall ill if we can't love. This is in his 1914 essay on narcissism, where he posits the distinction between narcissism and object love. And I wish he'd stuck with that instead of hiding that that's what psychoanalysis is all about and switching to this ridiculous language of mental health. Psychoanalysis is about salvation. And again, I mean that in a secular sense, saved from narcissism and help to open up to the other. And help to begin to be able to love. Freud was embarrassed by this way of talking. He hated religion, and he hated the religions of love. So he switched to this language of mental health. I wish he just stuck with stating that the goal of psychoanalysis is to help people transcend narcissism and acquire the ability to love the other, not just love themselves. Okay, evolutionary, PS to D, beta elements to alpha elements and more complex elements of the mind and more complex levels of thinking for beyond. Narcissism to object love, development of the capacity for concern, Winnicott. These are our goals. We've spent decades pretending we don't have a goal. What baloney? Of course we have a goal. We're out to help people evolve. But, people have gotten fixated and stuck. And we're trying to offer them an opportunity to resume their development, soul development. This is what we're doing. So in therapy, we're promoting soul development. I mean, we're not whipping people and we're not giving them lectures and we're not giving them sermons. And we sort of even try to hide from ourselves what it is that we're doing, as if we don't have a goal. We're trying to help people transcend false selves and develop both a conscience and a true self. Conscience and true self, to me, are two sides of the same coin. They're directly linked. Okay, many books by psychoanalysts have the word soul in the title. Certainly Carl Gustav Jung, Modern Man in Search of a Soul, that was back in, what, the 1950s? 1984, Bruno Bettelheim writes, Freud showed us how the soul could become aware of itself. In his work and in his writings, Freud often spoke of the soul, of its nature and structure, its development, its attributes, how it reveals itself in all we do and dream. Unfortunately, nobody who reads him in English could guess this, because nearly all his many references to the soul and to matters pertaining to the soul have been excised in translation, unquote. For Bettelheim, properly translated from the German, psychoanalysis would be called soul study, psychoanalysts soul doctors, and the psychoanalytic process recognized as, quotes, a spiritual journey of self-discovery, unquote, page 4 of Bettelheim's book. Now, of course, Bettelheim was splitting and projecting. He was idealizing the humanistic side of Freud's work while blaming his materialism and reductionism on James Strachey's misleading translations. The truth is, Freud was both a humanist and a reductionist. But to Bettelheim's credit, he reminds the English-speaking world that psyche refers not merely to mind, but also to soul and spirit. But what do we mean by spirit and soul? These terms have widely different meanings for different people. We may speak, for example, of a person being in high or low spirits. We can speak of team spirit, or the spirit of democracy, or of the Holy Spirit. In spiritualism, efforts are made to contact the spirits of the dead. In various forms of occultism and esotericism, there's belief in so-called spirit entities, such as ghosts, angels, and demons. Of course, I'm not interested in any of that woo-woo stuff. As for the soul, according to the Cambridge Dictionary, it is the spiritual part of a person that some people believe continues to exist in some form after their body has died, or the part of a person that is not physical and experiences deep feelings and emotions, unquote. We may speak of divided souls, old souls, and lost souls, as well as of soul murder, Schengold, soul mates. I finally found mine. Took me a long time, but finally found her. Soul music, soul for performances. As far as I'm concerned personally, I'm employing the terms soul, spirit, etc. in a strictly secular, psychological, and non-metaphysical sense. And I'm seeking to emphasize the centrality of the ethical dimension of soul development, the ethical dimension of soul development. Many of the other writers who use the term soul are linking it to, well, not to ethical development really at all. Psychoanalysts generally don't want to talk about ethics. We're prepared to link psychoanalysis to medicine, We're prepared to link it to neuroscience. Meg Harris Williams and Donald Meltzer, they're willing to link it to the poetic and the mythopoetic. I'm emphasizing the affinity of psychoanalysis to ethics, by which I mean conscience, not superego, not superego. When my Philadelphia friend and colleague, Elio Frateroli, in 2001, he publishes his book, Healing the Soul in the Age of the Brain. That's the main title. I think he mostly has in mind what he says in his subtitle, Becoming Conscious in an Unconscious World. Well, that's traditional psychoanalysis, making the unconscious conscious. And he's linking that activity, quite rightly, to soul development or the healing of the soul by making what is unconscious conscious, like making one's affects conscious instead of splitting them off. Soul is certainly linked with affect. Soul development means integrating our affective life for sure. But I think it's significant that few discussions of spirituality and soul making, even by psychoanalysts like Meg Harris Williams and Tyler and others, very few of them seem to regard ethics, guilt, superego, and conscience as of central importance in soul development. A notable exception in this regard is Elio Frateroli, in 2013, 13 years after he published Healing the Soul in the Age of the Brain, he wrote a wonderful paper. It's collected in one of the books edited by Salman Akhtar. The title of that book is Guilt, Something, Nature, Management, whatever. And Frateroli writes a paper in that book, and his paper is called Reflections on the Absence of Morality in Psychoanalytic Theory and Therapy. Okay, this neglect of guilt and conscience in relation to soul development, given the flight from guilt, the guilt evasion that has characterized psychoanalysis over the past many decades, this is not surprising. For many years in the English-speaking world, Freudian psychoanalysis was associated primarily with Enlightenment rationalism, materialism, and atheism. But by mid-century, a range of anti-reductionist, anti-positivist, and humanistic perspectives emerged in the work of writers such as Erich Fromm, Donald Winnicott, and Wilfred Bion. By the early 1980s, Michael Eigen was writing of, quotes, the area of faith in Winnicott, Lacan, and Bion. And several prominent analysts were not only writing about psychoanalysis and religion with considerably more sympathy for the latter than Freud displayed, like William Meisner, for example, vis-a-vis Christianity, Epstein and Safran vis-a-vis Buddhism. But they were also writing about their personal struggles to reconcile religion and spirituality with their practice of psychoanalytic theory and practice, e.g. Stanley Levy in 1977. Regrettably, at the same time as these more spiritually open perspectives were emerging, psychoanalysts, like other members of the culture of narcissism, Christopher Lasch in 1979, psychoanalysts were increasingly engaged in guilt evasion. As early as 1960, Sandler in England was observing that at the Hampstead Clinic, analysts were no longer sorting their clinical material around concepts of guilt and superego. 20 years later in New York, Jacob Arlo made the same point. He observed that few papers or clinical discussions were focusing on these issues. By the turn of the century, 1998, Leon Wormser, was referring to the superego as, quotes, the sleeping giant of contemporary psychoanalysis. Like the society around us, the neoliberal capitalist society around us, which was hostile to regulators, We, in psychoanalysis, we're turning attention away from the regulators, superego and conscience, and evading guilt. Look where that culture put into the White House. The master guilt evader made it to the presidency. Anyway, according to Marcuse in 1970 and Kohut in 1977, guilty man, the structured and conflicted personality of the modern era, had been replaced in our culture by tragic man, the postmodern, unstructured, narcissistic personality of our time. In my view, this is a sociological perspective. What they're observing of the new kinds of patients who come with unstructured personalities, and it's a descriptively valid, but it's a surface sociological observation, focusing on manifest social changes, but fails to recognize the latent or unconscious guilt of tragic man, whose fragmentation and emptiness, you could call that soullessness, result not from simple deprivation, but from the unconscious operations of what Bion called the ego-destructive superego. This fragmentation is brought about by something that fragments, that attacks. It's the result of an unconscious self-attack, not simple failure of self-object function at the beginning. In any case, it's impossible for me, at least, to conceive of personal or soul development apart from a central concern with ethics and morality. One's soul, which for me is directly connected to both the true self and the conscience, the soul is something that can be sickened. It can be corrupted and even lost through unethical practices. It's not just the New Age varieties of spirituality that display our culture's flight from guilt. In addition to Jungian preoccupations with the mythical and our quasi-Buddhist obsession with mindfulness, recent psychoanalytically informed discussions of soul-making ground the process not in ethical, but in literary and mythopoetic considerations. In his foreword to Meg Harris Williams' 2005, The Veil of Soul-Making, the post-Kleinian model of the mind and its poetic origins, Donald Meltzer proclaims, psychoanalysis acknowledges its poetic forebears and joins the artistic family, unquote. Okay, we join the artistic family. Apparently, it's easier for psychoanalysis to ally itself with medicine, neuroscience, meditation, and the arts, rather than to acknowledge its affinity with ethics. I've argued for 15 years or so that psychoanalysis is and always has been an ethical practice, a value infused rather than a value neutral science, despite our attempts to disguise the fact. We've always stood for life over death, love over hate, and truth over lies. Our therapy has always involved an albeit subtle and tactful attempt to help patients develop or evolve psychologically, an effort to facilitate their progression from narcissism to object love, PS to D, etc., etc. Okay, this evolution is tantamount to what in the psychology of religion is called a conversion. I want to shock people. We psychoanalysts are in the conversion business. We're trying to convert people from one mental world to another, from the paranoid, schizoid, narcissistic world to the depressive, reparative world of concern and repair and love. That's what we're about. But we won't admit it. Other people don't practice what they preach. We refuse to preach what we practice. we refuse to even notice it ourselves. Let's make the unconscious conscious and become conscious of the fact that we are engaged in promoting a conversion. Now, it's not a conversion like Saul experienced on the road to Damascus when he became St. Paul. We're not promoting a radical, sudden conversion. We're promoting a very slow, very subtle conversion process. But it's still a conversion. You wind up living in a different mental world. And people who are very ensconced in D don't want to evolve because they feel that the move into D is a catastrophe for them. Imagine a deeply narcissistic person having to move into a world where he admits he's a sinner, where he admits he's bad, not all bad, both good and bad, but he contains badness. He can't, at least when he's still splitting, he can't go there because he's afraid that if he admits even the slightest bit of badness, it's going to spread like ink in the water and he's going to be all bad. That's his splitting. So we need to work on his splitting to help him overcome the splitting, and then he can integrate his badness. He can start having reparative guilt, regret. He can start to mourn the damage he's done to other people and to himself. That mourning is a part of a process of repentance so that he can actually begin to change. So this is a conversion. We don't want to look at it that way. It's a slow, gradual conversion. And this is central to soul making or soul development. Okay, I think those are the main points I wanted to make. Thanks.
Thank you, Don. We'll move right on to Stephen.
Well, thank you, Vivian and the committee for inviting me to participate today. Thank you, Don, for your thoughts and for being willing to share this with me. And thank you, everybody, for showing up. And I hope you will feel like you've been rewarded for the expenditure of your time. So I'll start by asking the question, what is the soul? I grew up in a Christian family that ensured that I knew that a person's soul was something vital to their being as a human that needs saving. The soul was often referred to also as the person's spirit. And it was to be brought into union with God as spirit, God being spirit, through that process of salvation and would live on eternally. In the Old Testament, the word soul is often used to imply the life in its totality of the person. The prophet Elijah, for example, when he raised the poor widow's deceased son to life again, he said, quote, "Let this child's soul come back to him," end of quote. As the total life of the person, the body was included within the life of the soul. In the New Testament, Jesus famously said, quote, "What profit is it to a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul?" End of quote. The connotation is that the soul is sustained by moral integrity and uprightness, just as Don's been talking about, and jeopardized by the evil of self-aggrandizing indulgence. Biblically, the term soul and the term spirit are often used interchangeably. The scriptures overall view the soul of a person as that which transcends the forces of corruption that lead to death, to which all else, including the body, are subject. And yet, in its claims about resurrection, according to St. Paul, the body, quote, is sown a natural body and is raised a spiritual body, end of quote. Immortality is therefore claimed for all persons. When I turned my attention to training in psychoanalysis, I think a significant part of the appeal of psychoanalysis was that it seemed similarly attuned to the soul and was clearly striving to systematically understand and then to devise a method of addressing the sicknesses of the soul. Bruno Bettelheim, who has already been referred to, called these sicknesses of the soul the dark forces that reside in us that enslave us without us even knowing it. In his book, Freud and Man's Soul, he decried the faulty ways in which Freud's works were translated into English in such a way as to lure readers into a scientific attitude. This is a quote from him, into a scientific attitude toward man and his actions, a scientific understanding of the unconscious and how it conditions much of our behavior, end of quote. He believed Freud's, quote, greatest concern was with man's innermost being, to which he most frequently referred through the use of a metaphor, man's soul, because the word soul evokes so many emotional connotations. It is the greatest shortcoming of the current English versions of his works that they give no hint of this, end of quote. And Don's already spoken about how he recognized that there was this grand effort by the translators to ensure that references to the soul were basically eliminated from the translations. Dominique Scarfoni concurs with Bettelheim in recognizing that the translator of Freud's work, James Strachey, chose to translate the German word Seele into psyche or mind instead of soul. In his work, The Unpassed, Scarfoni says that recent French translators of Freud's work from German into French noticed that when Freud used the adjective psychic, he was referring to something structured, leaving the soulical to refer to the overall life of the person, including body, and is the generative stratum out of which the psyche differentiates. The apparatus of the soul, then, encompasses the more structured and differentiated entity called the psychic apparatus or the mind. This would be the apparatus we understand to be structured as id, ego, superego, and to expand on that, the ego ideal and conscience. The border between the two, in other words, between the encompassed psyche within the larger context of the soul, would be seen to be porous. And so this organization of the life of the person is dynamic and therefore open to therapeutic intervention. A little more will be said about that a bit later. When the term soul is used, there tends to be a sense or an implication of reaching beyond oneself to that which is greater than oneself, and hence, in my view, the spiritual connotations. The terms soul music and soul mate carry the implication of something emotional, passionate, connecting in deep ways. For several decades now, psychiatry has been characterized largely with a biopharmaceutical approach to so-called mental illness, and language having to do with matters of the soul, like soul making, has been largely banished. Similarly, psychology has been preoccupied with the academic pursuit of brain function, cognition in ways that are measurable and testable with the limited tools of scientific investigation. Again, referring to Elio Frattaroli, he writes eloquently about medical model psychiatry, which treats the emotionally suffering human as a physical and chemical system that needs to be adjusted with drugs, versus a psychotherapy model psychiatry, which attends to the soul in the conflict. So, can psychoanalysis make a soul? Our title for this talk is Psychoanalysis as Soul Making. I have to say that I think psychoanalysis as soul making implies a pretentious claim. I do, however, think psychoanalysis has a powerful contribution to make in enabling the character, flexibility, and freedom of the soul to all flourish and expand. In the book I wrote, published in 2017, Probing the Mind to Free the Soul, as my chosen title makes clear, I was viewing that the psychoanalytic enterprise is a method of freeing the soul. Freeing it from what? From its entanglements and conflicts, from inhibitions, from superego oppression, from suffocation of the imagination. In the introduction of the book, I commented that I was playing with the two words mind and soul, since at that time I was seeing them as essentially the same and generally interchangeable terms. I'm now preferring the differentiation between them as per Scarfoni that I spoke about above. Alan Jones, in his book, Sorting, The Desert Way of Spirituality, says that both the ancient tradition of desert spirituality with its deprivations of comforts and distractions, as which would of course give rise to the introspective searching of oneself, as well as psychoanalysis, invite the person who is willing to wake up, to look, to give attention, to focus, to be receptive, and to change. What the willing are looking for is the truth about oneself. So I think I prefer to think of psychoanalysis as truth-seeking and meaning-making. However psychoanalysts may conceive of the unconscious, there would be near unanimity on the fact of the human subject being affected by his or her unconscious, such that no human is ever fully in charge of himself in the way he thinks he is. Since what is unconscious is by definition outside of our awareness, then a method is needed for accessing the unconscious, which is the method discovered by Freud. This unique setup fosters the development of transference, defined simply as the compelled repetition of emotional configurations involving important others of one's past, now focused in the present on the person of the analyst, or more accurately, the person that the analysand is apperceiving the person of the analyst to be. In the throes of experiencing transference, the patient discovers truths about him or herself, which he could never otherwise realize. Freud's claim that psychoanalysis works by rendering the unconscious conscious is proven to be true, although this entails far more than an intellectual enlightenment. The new dawning realizations that are largely drawn from the unconscious by the power of the transference involves emotional intensity. It's not really an intellectual experience, although it's that too. Psychoanalysis is a long and deep immersion into the life of the one who is seeking. In this context, through the workings of transference, the ways in which the person's psyche has structured itself to defend against both the destructive, unbinding aspects of the sexual drive and against the superego's shame-inducing claims against the self can gradually become apparent. Then the truth of oneself becomes known. Jesus said that if one is a disciple of his, and perhaps parenthetically, this can be taken to mean that one is a truth seeker, Then they will know the truth, and the truth will set them free. Jean Laplanche would say that in such work, as we're talking about, this long immersion, there is a progressive detranslating of the narrative of the one who has been. In other words, the narrative of one's life as one has understood oneself to be. A progressive detranslating of that, that of course came into being in response to the environmental codes that conveyed how one was to be. And the detranslating is followed by a retranslating and a repeated cycling and helical kind of movement forward. The creating of a new narrative of one who is that takes account of the truth realized. Laplanche also emphasizes that it is in human nature to innately seek to make meaning out of what is unclear. He also insists that the only hermeneute in the psychoanalytic exercise is the patient, meaning that the analyst serves only as a midwife to the birth of new meanings. Let me wrap up by itemizing some ways in which psychoanalysis has conceptualized what we are considering as soul making. First would be the idea of rendering the unconscious conscious so that the ego can revise the narrative. Second, untangling the knots of unconscious conflict. Thirdly, killing off in effigy, so to speak, of the castrating parents who remain in the superego in the mind in order to become more fully oneself. Fourthly, discovering the falsities of oneself in order to become a true self. Identifying the largely unconscious superego so as to be able to intentionally disempower and modify it, and simultaneously learn to live by conscience. Finally, of course, these are only several ways of conceptualizing what goes on in psychoanalysis. There, I think, could be many others. But the last thing I'll say is from Alan Jones, who was the author of Soul Making, and he's not a psychoanalyst, but clearly is familiar with it. The making, he says, I quote, "The making of a soul, which is another way of talking about learning what love is, requires what the poet John Keats called negative capability." And this is from Keats. Negative capability, that is, when a man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. Jones says, finally, that the desert of desert spirituality means being alone, and that solitude is needed to learn love. He says, quote, "Here is the basic paradox of soul making. In order for me to be myself, I need to be able to be alone. In order to be myself, I need to be with others." End of quote. This paradox, I would say, is in psychoanalysis too. The patient is with the analyst, but is also peculiarly alone. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Stephen. Before we open it to the audience, I wondered if you both wanted to make some comments to each other.
Dawn, one of the things I wanted to say about psychoanalysis striving to be value neutral is that a couple of days ago, members of the International Psychoanalytic Association received a message from the current president, Harriet Wolff, urging societies, psychoanalytic societies around the world to engage in protecting of psychoanalytic values. And it was very explicit about this in the face of course, authoritarian attacks on a whole variety of things, including some of these things which we value. And I just wanted to highlight three of the values that were listed in her letter, which specifically have to do with what I think would be ethics. That is the alleviation of suffering as a value of psychoanalysis. Secondly, individuality and diversity. And thirdly, humane treatment of our fellow humans. I just thought this was so interesting that there would appear, at the moment at least in the IPA, to be a clear embracing of psychoanalysis as not value neutral at all. Don, you're muted.
You're muted, Don.
I said very encouraging. That's a very welcome development. Am I permitted to speak at this point?
Yeah, if you wanted to comment on anything Stephen had to say, or...
Yeah, well, Stephen, you said so much, and there's so many points that we could talk about, but the one thing that jumped out at me was that made me uncomfortable was the killing off of the parents in the superego. You know, you corrected me years ago when I got all gung-ho for a while about Freud's idea of demolition of the superego, and you corrected me. You said, well, you reminded me of what I had said 5 years earlier. In 2013, I got it right. We need a superego, but we need a superego called out and corrected by conscience. But, you know, for a while there, I joined Freud in his enthusiasm for demolishing the superego. Ferenczi and Alexander also got caught up in that. And I remembered that back in 2013, I'd actually quoted Jesus, who said, "Think not that I am come to destroy the law and the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill." So I had known that. I kind of lost touch with it. You helped bring me back. So now I think I'm going to perform the same service for you. I don't think we want to kill the parents in the superego, because if we do, we're going to feel terrible guilt, and that's not going to lead to progress. It's a matter of separating and individuating from them, which may well feel like killing them, but that's a fantasy, not a fact. We're separating, we're growing up. It often feels like killing, but it isn't killing, and we need to help patients know that. I wish that I'd had an analyst who could have helped me realize that the reason I was procrastinating in the writing of my PhD thesis was that I was captured by the fantasy that my getting my PhD was killing my father. And when I got the PhD, my dad took me out to celebrate. He was proud of me. And I'm sitting there sweating, thinking I've just planted a dagger between his shoulder blades, which is sheer fantasy. But that's why I was procrastinating. I wasn't procrastinating about finishing my PhD. I was procrastinating about getting around to killing my dad. I was so caught up in that fantasy. Anyway, so not killing, but well, separating from.
I accept that as graciously as you accepted my correction. However, let me put it this way. I think I put it that way partly to be a bit provocative, but also, interestingly, with a patient yesterday morning, there was clearly this coming into view, the difficulty, or at least the challenge, of getting out from under the parental hegemony in the mind.
Yeah.
And it feeling like it might be a horrifying disloyalty.
Yes.
And it's almost as if to be able to get free of that hegemony that we tend to kind of bring with us into mature life from our parental upbringing is to cause a death. And I think it can feel that way. Yes, it's fantasy, but it can feel like we'd be doing something horrifying if we were to differentiate in the way that we need to.
Right. Yeah.
Don, I'll just make a comment about something you said, that about psychoanalysis seeming to be more comfortable with sort of aligning itself with the artistic, the poetic, the artistic, perhaps the meditative, etc.,
Right.
and not so much with ethics. And I think that's probably been a valid concern. But I obviously have some concern about the discomfort within psychoanalysis with the alignment of what can be thought of as religious, or certainly the supernatural.
I can do.
And it's something that, of course,
I'll try.
prefer to sort of contribute to a modification of, let's put it that way.
Just want to make sure people are muted, because there is some interference coming in. Sorry, Stephen.
Yeah, that's all. I just wanted to comment on that. There was this area, and still is, I'm quite sure, within psychoanalysis, broadly speaking, that has a great deal of discomfort with connotations of spirituality, of the supernatural.
Right. Well, my personal bias, of course, is that that's probably a necessary and a good thing. Supernatural. Well, look, I've discovered that I'm split. Ian McGilchrist, the master and his servant, the two different hemispheres of the brain. And he says we live in a left hemisphere dominant civilization. It's true.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm split the way I think we all are. So my left hemisphere wants nothing to do with the supernatural, wants nothing to do with it. When I die, I think I just cease. That's what I believe. But in my right hemisphere, I believe when I die, I'm going into the arms of Jesus. Do I believe that? No, I don't believe it, but I feel it to be true. I feel it to be true. So I've got an evangelical Christian in my right hemisphere. I've got an Enlightenment rationalist scientist in my left hemisphere. It's not easy to work out a synthesis.
To paraphrase someone from the Bible who said that I believe, but help my unbelief.
Yes.
You might say, I don't believe, but help me believe.
Well, okay. I don't think I want to believe. I'm glad I feel. I'm in love with Jesus, have always been since a boy. And I'm thankful for the Christian ethics. But as an Enlightenment rationalist, I think I want to keep these two things separated. I don't know, religion has led to so many wars. Maybe it's good for psychoanalysis to, as you pointed out, Harriet Wolff is making the statement, they're starting to admit that psychoanalysis is an ethical practice. Good. Do we want to go on into religion? I don't think so. We leave that to the privacy of every individual, I think.
So let's open it up now at this point to the audience. We have a question or a comment. Arash, you can